The Billionaire Gala was supposed to be a celebration of generosity, but before the first champagne glass was raised, a single father was shoved through the marble doors in front of hundreds of the city's richest people, and the woman who owned the entire building watched him leave with tears in her eyes. Nobody understood why the CEO, Eleanor Voss, had suddenly abandoned her own guests and disappeared into the parking garage. Nobody knew that she was hiding inside the battered truck of the man they had just humiliated, clutching a tiny silver pendant that had once belonged to his dead wife. And nobody could have imagined that the man they called a nobody was about to force one of the most powerful women in the city to confront the greatest mistake of her life. If you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can keep bringing you stories that remind us what truly matters. The man being pushed out was 38-year-old Grant Mercer, a quiet single father with grease beneath his fingernails, an old brown jacket, and a faded pickup truck that had more miles on it than most of the cars parked outside the gala. Grant had not come because he wanted to mingle with billionaires. He had come because a local foundation had chosen him as one of several community volunteers being honored for helping families repair homes after a devastating spring flood. Grant had spent months repairing damaged electrical systems, fixing broken heaters, replacing ruined doors, and refusing payment whenever he knew a family could not afford it. His 11-year-old daughter, Wren, had been the person who pushed him to accept the invitation. She had carefully ironed his only good shirt that morning and told him that her mother would have been proud to see him standing in a room full of people who could afford everything but still needed someone willing to get his hands dirty. Grant had smiled at that, although hearing his late wife mentioned still caused an ache that never completely disappeared. His wife, Marissa, had died 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving Grant to raise Wren alone. Since then, he had learned how to braid hair badly, pack lunches creatively, attend parent meetings after exhausting workdays, and become both mother and father without ever pretending that one person could replace two. He had also learned to hide his exhaustion. That morning, Wren had hugged him at the front door and reminded him not to forget the little silver pendant he always wore beneath his shirt. It had belonged to Marissa, and Grant almost never removed it. He had touched it gently before leaving and promised his daughter he would be home before dinner. The gala was being held inside the Voss Foundation's Grand Cultural Center, a building of white stone, enormous glass walls, and polished floors that reflected every chandelier overhead. Grant arrived early, nervous but determined. He stood near the entrance while wealthy guests moved around him in tailored suits and elegant dresses. At first, nobody paid much attention to him. Then a sharply dressed security supervisor named Preston Vale noticed Grant's old truck keys in his hand and saw the grease marks on his cuffs. Preston approached him with the polite smile people sometimes use when they are trying to remove someone without appearing cruel. Grant explained that his name was on the volunteer list, but Preston checked twice and insisted that the invitation must have been issued by mistake. Grant tried to show him the confirmation email. Preston barely looked at it. A few nearby guests began watching. Grant could feel the humiliation spreading across his face, but he stayed calm because he had promised Wren he would not lose his temper. Then Preston made the mistake that changed everything. He accused Grant of pretending to belong among people who had earned their place there. Grant stared at him for a long second, then quietly said that he had not come to belong anywhere. He had simply come because somebody had invited him. Before he could explain further, Preston grabbed his arm and ordered security to escort him outside. Across the room, Eleanor Voss saw the entire thing. At 46, Eleanor was one of the most influential CEOs in the country, a woman whose company owned hotels, transportation firms, technology investments, and commercial properties across several states. She was known for being brilliant, controlled, and almost impossible to intimidate. But what nobody in that room knew was that Eleanor had spent the previous hour searching through an old collection of photographs and personal belongings that had been recovered from a storage unit belonging to her younger sister, Claire, who had died years earlier. Claire had been the only person Eleanor ever truly feared disappointing. Before Claire's death, the sisters had been inseparable. After a painful family dispute, they had stopped speaking for nearly 2 years, and Eleanor had carried the guilt ever since. That morning, Eleanor had found a photograph showing Claire beside a young woman she recognized immediately. Marissa Mercer. Claire had once volunteered with Marissa at a community housing organization. Eleanor had known Marissa's name, but she had never met her. Behind the photograph was a handwritten note mentioning Marissa's husband and daughter. The discovery had unsettled Eleanor more than she understood. She had asked an assistant to locate Grant Mercer and learned that he was one of the volunteers attending the gala. That was why Eleanor had been watching the entrance so carefully, and then she saw him. Grant was being pushed through the doors. Eleanor stepped forward, but before she could reach him, Preston ordered the doors closed. Grant walked across the bright daytime plaza toward the parking area, his shoulders stiff and his head lowered. He did not curse. He did not demand an apology. He simply walked away as though he had already learned that dignity sometimes meant leaving a place before anger could take it from you. Eleanor turned sharply and asked why he had been removed. Preston gave her an explanation about security concerns, but Eleanor immediately realized he was lying. The volunteer list had Grant's name. His invitation was legitimate. The foundation had selected him personally. Eleanor looked through the glass doors at Grant reaching his battered truck and felt something inside her snap. She walked out. Grant was already opening the driver's door when Eleanor called his name. He turned, surprised to see the CEO herself crossing the pavement toward him. Eleanor apologized, but Grant shook his head. He told her the apology was unnecessary because he knew exactly how the world worked. Eleanor tried to explain that she had not authorized what happened, but Grant said that was the problem with people in powerful positions. They often believed something was not their fault simply because they had not personally done it. Then he climbed into his truck. Eleanor stood there, stunned. Grant started the engine, but before he could pull away, he noticed something lying on the passenger seat. It was a small silver pendant. His heart stopped as he recognized it instantly. It was not merely similar to Marissa's pendant. It was the exact pendant he had worn that morning, the one he had touched before leaving home. Grant looked down at his chest and realized the chain was gone. He opened the door and stepped out. Eleanor had already seen the pendant through the windshield. Her face had gone pale. Grant asked where she had gotten it. Eleanor admitted that she had found it in an old box connected to her late sister Claire. Grant took one step toward her, unable to breathe normally. He told Eleanor that the pendant had been given to Marissa by a woman named Claire nearly 14 years earlier, before Marissa and Grant were married. Eleanor stared at him. Grant asked how she knew Claire. Eleanor explained that Claire had once worked with Marissa during a community rebuilding project. She remembered the pendant because Claire had purchased it as a gift for a young woman who had helped save several families from being evicted after a landlord dispute. Eleanor had not known the pendant was still with Marissa's family. She had found it that morning among Claire's belongings, along with a photograph of Marissa and a handwritten note. Grant's hands began trembling. He asked what the note said. Eleanor hesitated before explaining that Claire had written about Marissa's courage and about a husband named Grant who had stayed beside her when she was struggling. Claire had written that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped Eleanor would one day understand that people were more valuable than status, money, or reputation. Grant looked away. For years, he had wondered why Marissa had treasured the pendant so deeply. She had always told him it represented a promise from a stranger who believed she could become more than the circumstances surrounding her. Grant had assumed Claire was simply someone from Marissa's past. He had never known that Claire had been Eleanor's sister. Then Eleanor made an unexpected confession. She told Grant that Claire had tried to contact her shortly before she died. Eleanor had been angry at the time and refused to answer. She had been too proud to forgive her sister for a disagreement neither of them could even clearly remember anymore. Claire died before they reconciled. Eleanor had spent years pretending that her regret was manageable. Grant looked at the CEO standing beside his old truck, and for the first time he did not see a billionaire. He saw a woman carrying a wound she had hidden behind success, but Grant had his own wound. He told Eleanor that Marissa had spent the last months of her life believing that people eventually left when life became difficult. Grant had promised her he would not. He had kept that promise every day since. He had worked until his hands hurt, raised rent alone, and accepted that he might never again have the kind of life he once imagined. He told Eleanor that he did not need money or a place at her gala. What hurt was being treated as though kindness had no value unless it came dressed in expensive clothing. Eleanor lowered her eyes, then something happened that neither of them expected. A voice came from inside Grant's truck. Wren. She had been waiting in the back seat because Grant had planned to drop her at a friend's house after the gala. She had heard enough through the cracked window to understand that her father was hurting. She stepped out holding her school backpack, looked at Eleanor, and then at the pendant in her hand. Wren asked if it belonged to her mother. Grant nodded. Wren took the pendant carefully and held it against her palm. Eleanor watched the girl's face change as she realized that the stranger standing before her had known her mother. Eleanor knelt down, not caring about the expensive fabric of her dress touching the pavement, and told Wren that her mother had once been brave enough to help people who could never repay her. She told her that Claire had admired Marissa deeply. Then Eleanor admitted that she had spent years thinking success meant never being vulnerable, never admitting fault, and never letting anyone see regret. Wren looked at her and said something simple that stayed with Eleanor. She said that her father always told her people could make mistakes and still choose to do better. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in years, she let herself cry in public. Grant did not suddenly forgive her. He did not forget what had happened at the gala. Instead, he told Eleanor that forgiveness was not a door someone else could force open. It was something earned slowly through changed behavior. Eleanor accepted that without argument, then she turned around and walked back toward the building. Grant assumed she was returning to her guests. She wasn't. Eleanor entered the gala and walked directly to the microphone. Hundreds of people fell silent as the CEO stood before them, still visibly emotional. She explained that a man who had been invited to honor his service to the community had just been humiliated because someone decided his appearance did not match the room. She did not blame the staff alone. She accepted responsibility as the leader of the organization. She announced that Preston would be removed from his position pending an investigation, but she also made it clear that firing one person would not solve the deeper problem. Then Eleanor did something even harder. She admitted that she had built an organization that celebrated charity while sometimes failing to respect the people who performed it. She canceled the remainder of the gala's formal program and asked the guests to listen instead to the community volunteers who had spent years serving families without recognition. Some guests looked uncomfortable. Others looked ashamed. A few quietly left. Eleanor did not stop them. Outside, Grant and Wren waited beside the truck. When Eleanor eventually came back, she carried the photograph of Claire and Marissa. She handed it to Grant and told him that she wanted him to keep it. Grant studied the image, and for the first time in years he saw Marissa laughing without knowing someone was taking her picture. He smiled through tears. Eleanor asked whether Grant would consider helping her rebuild the foundation's volunteer program from the ground up. Not as an employee beneath her. Not as a publicity figure. As someone whose experience mattered. Grant said he would think about it. That answer was enough. Over the following weeks, Eleanor kept her word. She redesigned the foundation's volunteer policies, created paid training opportunities for tradespeople, and established emergency repair grants for single-parent families. She also began visiting community projects without cameras or press releases. Grant helped design the program, but he refused to let Eleanor turn his story into a marketing campaign. Wren became involved too. She started a small school project collecting handwritten notes of encouragement for families receiving assistance. Eleanor kept every note Wren gave her, but the biggest change happened between Grant and Eleanor. They did not become friends overnight. They did not pretend grief could disappear because two families had crossed paths. Instead, they slowly began talking about the people they had lost. Eleanor finally spoke openly about Claire. Grant talked about Marissa. They discovered that grief had made both of them afraid in different ways. Grant had become afraid of trusting anyone enough to lose them again. Eleanor had become afraid of admitting she cared because caring had once ended in unbearable regret. One afternoon, nearly a year after the gala, Eleanor stood outside Grant's garage as he repaired a battered truck belonging to a single mother from the neighborhood. Wren sat nearby doing homework. The silver pendant rested around her neck now. Grant had given it to her. Eleanor asked why. Grant explained that Marissa had once believed the pendant represented hope passed from one person to another. He wanted Wren to carry that hope forward. Eleanor looked at the girl and smiled. Grant told Eleanor that he had finally understood something. The pendant had never really belonged to Marissa, Claire, him, or even Wren. It belonged to every person who chose to help someone when there was nothing to gain. Eleanor nodded, tears gathering in her eyes again. Then she told him that Claire had been right all along. Money could build buildings, power could open doors, reputation could make people listen, but kindness could make someone feel human again. Grant looked at the woman who had once watched him get thrown out of a room she owned and then had humbled herself enough to change what that room represented. He finally forgave her, not because the humiliation had never happened, not because the past had become unimportant. He forgave her because she had stopped defending the person she used to be and started becoming someone better. Wren came running toward them and asked if they wanted to see her newest school drawing. It showed 3 people standing beneath a giant silver pendant, with a small handwritten sentence underneath. You never know how much one kind person can change another person's life. Grant stared at the drawing for several seconds. Eleanor placed a hand over her heart, and under the ordinary afternoon sun, beside an old truck that had carried a grieving father through the hardest years of his life, 3 people stood together and understood that second chances did not erase the past, they simply proved that the past did not have to control the future. If this story touched your heart, please leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe is harder, asking for forgiveness or choosing to forgive. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, because sometimes the person standing outside the door is carrying the very lesson everyone inside needs to hear. And if this story reminded you that kindness can cross every line of wealth, status, grief, and pride, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the greatest second chance does not come when someone opens a door for you. Sometimes it comes when someone finally realizes that they should never have closed the door in the first place.